Today, we are taking a little bit of a leap into an aircraft that served across all branches and multiple nations. In fact, the aircraft is even still in service with some other nations. Today, we will be talking about the lead sled, the flying anvil, the F-4 Phantom II, American air power during Vietnam, and the workhorse for many other nations with a long operational history. So, let's get started. In 1952, there were very few aircraft competitions on the horizon, so McDonnell performed an internal study and concluded the U.S. Navy had the greatest need for a new aircraft. So, in 1953, McDonnell Aircraft began revising the F-3H Demon, expanding its capabilities and giving it better performance. What came of was the Super Demon, and interestingly, the aircraft was made to be modular, as it could be fitted with 1 or 2 seat nose sections for different missions, as well as different nose cones to accommodate different radars, cameras for reconnaissance, or just different weapons. Now, the Super Demon was overlooked for the F-8 Crusaders, so the design was reworked into an all-weather fighter bomber and was given the internal designation of the AH-1. On October 18th of 1954, the company received a letter of intent to purchase 2 YAH-1 prototypes. Then, on May 26, 1955, 4 naval officers arrived and threw a curveball at McDonnell, giving them an entirely new set of requirements. The thought behind it was that the Navy already had the A-4 for ground attack and the F-8 for dogfighting, so the project now had to fulfill the need for an all-weather fleet defense interceptor. In addition, one of the requirements was the aircraft must have an additional seat to operate the radar system on board the aircraft, as the Navy believed having a single pilot manage everything themselves was going to overload them with information. So McDonnell reworked the aircraft again into the XF-4H-1, which was designed to carry 4 AAM-N6 Sparrow 3 radar-guided missiles and was to be powered by 2 J-79 GE-8 engines. So, on July 25, 1955, the Navy ordered 2 XF-4H-1 test aircraft and 5 YF-4H-1 pre-production aircraft. The Phantom then made its maiden flight on May 27, 1958, with Robert C. Little at the controls. Initially, a hydraulic problem precluded the retraction of the landing gear, but subsequent flights went smoothly. Early testing did result in a redesign of the air intakes, including the distinctive addition of 12,500 holes to bleed off the slow-moving boundary layer of air from the surface of each intake ram. Serially produced aircraft would feature splitter plates to divert the boundary layer away from the intakes. Now, the aircraft was soon in competition with the XF-8U-3 Crusader 3. However, due to the cockpit workload and the Navy wanting a 2-seat aircraft, the F-4H was declared the winner in December of 1958. However, there were delays with the J-79 GE-8 engines, meaning the first production aircraft were fitted with the J-79 GE-2 and -2As. So, in 1959, the Phantom began carrier suitability trials, with the first complete launch and recovery cycle being performed on February 15th of 1960 aboard the USS Independence. Now, that isn't to say there weren't some teething issues with the F-4. For example, some early aircraft suffered from leaks from the internal wing-mounted fuel tanks. There were also issues with the aileron control cylinders, electrical connectors across the aircraft, and engine compartment fires. In fact, 85 early F-4s developed cracks in outer wing ribs and stringers due to high G maneuvers. Also, the J-79 engines produced a thick smoke trail, and the avionics were complicated for their time and required extensive maintenance. In terms of naming the aircraft, there were proposals to name the F-4 Satan or Mithras. However, in the end, the aircraft was given the much less controversial name of Phantom II. The name Phantom or Phantom I was taken by a previous McDonnell aircraft, the FH-1 Phantom. And the Air Force briefly gave the aircraft the designation of F-110A and named it the Spectre, but the Tri-Service Aircraft Designation System brought it back to the F-4 in 1962. Now, the Navy and Marine Corps operated Phantoms initially. However, the Air Force did receive Phantoms as a result of Robert McNamara's push to create a unified fighter for all branches. And after an F-4B won the Operation High Speed Fly-Off against an F-106 Delta Dart, the U.S. Air Force borrowed 2 naval F-4Bs, giving them their temporary designation, then used the 2 aircraft to develop the requirements for their own version. After the unification of designations, the naval version became the F-4B, and the U.S. Air Force version was designated the F-4C. The first Air Force Phantom performed its maiden flight on May 17th of 1963, exceeding Mach 2 during the flight. In total, 5,195 Phantoms were built. with 2,874 going to the United States Air Force, 1,264 going to the Navy and Marine Corps, and 1,057 being exported across the world. The Phantom also broke numerous world records, setting 16 to be specific, with 5 speed records remaining until the F-15 took their place in 1975. The Phantom was an interesting design for the time period, with the aircraft going from a fighter to a ground attack aircraft and finally to a fleet defense aircraft. So, to start off, the Phantom was a tandem seat, which is just having the seats in a row, fighter bomber designed for carrier-based intercepts. Despite its dimensions, the F-4 had a 60,000 pound maximum takeoff weight and was capable of reaching Mach 2.23. The external hardpoints were able to carry up to 18,650 pounds, ranging from air-to-air weaponry to unguided and guided munitions, and to even include some nuclear weapons. And being an interceptor developed during the early Cold War, it did not initially carry an internal cannon, though that was rectified with the United States Air Force's F-4E. The slogan for F-4 pilots was "Speed is life." Because of its high thrust and quick acceleration, it allowed the F-4s to engage and disengage at will. However, due to its heavy design, it wasn't the most maneuverable. It was often outpaced in dogfights with its Soviet counterparts. And despite the adverse yaw during hard maneuvering and being subject to irrecoverable spins during aileron rolls, the aircraft was said to be very responsive and easy to fly. And the J-79, well, Smokey, was said to be responsive as well, with quick spool-up times in comparison to other aircraft at the time. And of course, without the addition of an internal gun, it was often considered the biggest mistake in the Phantom's design. However, we'll get into why when we go over the Phantom's service in Vietnam. Now, to get more specific on the airframe design, we'll start at the wind tunnel. Wind tunnel testing revealed that there was a lateral instability that required a 5-degree dihedral, which is just a positive angle of the wing in comparison to the aircraft's body. And in order to avoid redesigning the titanium central section of the aircraft, the outer portion of the wing received a 12-degree dihedral, giving the Phantom its iconic look and averaging out to about 5 degrees for the full wingspan. The wings also received the distinctive dogtooth notching at the wingtips for improved control at high angles of attack. And the all-moving tailplane was given a 23-degree anhedral, which is just the opposite of a dihedral, so down instead of up, to also improve control at high AOAs while keeping the tail clear of engine exhaust. In addition, the air intakes were equipped with one fixed ramp and one variable geometry ramp, with automatic scheduling to give maximum pressure recovery between Mach 1.4 and Mach 2.2. In addition, due to the carrier operations of the F-4, the landing gear was designed to withstand landings of up to 23 feet a second and sink rate. And to put that into perspective, the average, normal, and stable approach in commercial aviation is normally a 10 feet per second sink rate, and we all know how hard those landings can feel. And finally, the all-weather interceptor capability was achieved with the AN/APQ-50 radar. However, later on in the Phantom's life, it received numerous new radar systems. Pulse Doppler radars were even introduced on later variants of the F-4F, which is the German designation for the aircraft that we will talk about later. And while on the topic of upgrades, smokeless engines were introduced on the F-4S, where the aircraft received the J79-10As. Also, the F-4J was the first fighter aircraft in the world with operational look-down, shoot-down capabilities, which just means the radar was able to detect, track, and guide weapons onto enemy aircraft below it. And to top it off, the F-4E introduced leading-edge slats to the wings to greatly improve stability in high AOA maneuvers at the cost of some top speed. There is a lot of operational history with the F-4, being exported to 11 other nations and operating in some capacity with the United States until 1996. There are also hundreds of stories from previous pilots and from the people who crewed them, so to make it easy to follow along, we will start with the United States, then proceed on to other nations who operated the Phantoms. And because the US operated them in the Marines, Navy, and Air Force, we'll start with the Navy as the aircraft was initially intended for them. So to start, on December 30th of 1960, VF-121 at Naval Air Station Miramar became the first squadron to operate Phantoms, operating the initial production F-4As. And on July 9th of 1961, VF-74 stationed at Naval Air Station Oceana became the first deployable squadron operating F-4Bs. Later on that same year in October, the squadron completed carrier qualifications, and the first full carrier deployment was between August of 1962 to March of 1963 aboard the USS Forrestal. The second deployable squadron for the U.S. Atlantic Fleet was VF-102, which operated F-4Bs, and immediately took the aircraft on a shakedown cruise aboard the USS Enterprise. And the first deployable squadron of Phantoms for the U.S. Pacific Fleet was the VF-114, which after receiving their F-4Bs participated in a cruise aboard the USS Kitty Hawk in September of 1962. By the time of the Gulf and Tonkin incident in August of 1964, 13 of the 31 deployable naval squadrons had received their Phantoms, with F-4Bs performing combat sorties over Vietnam on August 5th of 1964. With their first combat sortie being Bomber Escort in Operation Pierce Arrow, which was ordered to completely destroy any North Vietnamese naval vessels. Now, Navy pilots weren't used to flying with a radar intercept officer, or guy in the back, to assist them with their workload, but quickly adapted to and learned the benefits of having an additional person as air combat over Vietnam became a frequent event. Speaking of air combat, the first air-to-air victory came for the Phantom on April 9th of 1965 when an F-4B from VF-95 shot down a Chinese MiG-17. However, the aircraft was soon shot down, and the reason why continues to be surrounded in controversy. Though it is important to include an enemy report stating it was an AIM-7 from a friendly Phantom that took the aircraft down, it is very difficult to determine if that report is truthful. However, on June 17th of 1965, an F-4B from VF-21 shot down the first North Vietnamese MiG of the war. There were also modifications already well underway, with teething issues still being worked on, and the missing gun was even worked around, with the SUU-16 and SUU-23 gun pods being available for use. Now we jump forward a bit to May 10th of 1972, when an F-4J, a later variant of the Naval Phantom, under the control of Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham and Lieutenant William P. Driscoll, shot down 3 MiG-17s, becoming the only naval ace of the Vietnam War, for the previous encounter of a MiG and the reported downing of North Vietnamese ace Colonel Nguyen Thun, which is now considered mythical. However, on the return flight, their aircraft was damaged by an enemy SAM, and to avoid being captured, they flew their damaged and burning aircraft with the rudder and afterburner until they could safely eject over water. Lieutenant Cunningham and Lieutenant Driscoll would both survive, with Cunningham later becoming a Top Gun instructor, and Driscoll also becoming a Top Gun instructor, later flying the F-14 in the Naval Reserves. During the war, U.S. Navy Phantoms participated in 84 combat tours, claiming 40 air-to-air victories at the cost of 73 Phantoms lost in combat, and an additional 54 lost to mishaps. And in 1984, all naval F-4N Phantoms were retired from fleet service, with an F-4S being utilized in the Naval Reserves until 1987, where they were replaced by the legendary F-14A. The last Phantoms in service were QF-4N and QF-4S target drones, operated at Naval Air Station Point Mugu until they were retired in 2004. And on a final note for the U.S. Naval Phantoms, the Blue Angels operated the F-4J Phantom from 1969 until December of 1974, being replaced by the A-4F Skyhawk. Now let's chat about the U.S. Marines. The Marines received their first F-4Bs in June of 1962 with the VMFA 314 at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro. Phantoms with VMFA 323 flying from Puerto Rico provided air cover during Operation Power Pack for evacuating U.S. citizens from the Dominican Republic, additionally assisting the 508th Infantry Regiment in taking and securing a position east of the Duarte Bridge. Marine Phantoms from VMFA 531 were assigned at Da Nang Air Base on May 10, 1965, and were there initially to provide air defense for the Marine Corps, soon providing close air support with VMFA 314, 232, 323, and 542 joining them on the Bear Airfield. Marine F-4 pilots would claim 3 enemy MiGs at the cost of 75 lost in combat, mostly the ground fire, with 4 being lost to accidents. Phantoms from VMFA 323 and 531 operating from the USS Coral Sea participated in Operation Eagle Claw, which was a failed attempt to rescue 53 embassy staff being held captive by the Iranian regime after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. They were ordered to shoot down any Iranian aircraft, and due to Iran operating Phantoms at this point in time, They were painted with an orange stripe to differentiate the Marine Phantoms from the Iranian ones. However, the operation was called off early in the stages of execution. Now, to jump back to Vietnam, VMCJ-1 flew the first photo recon mission with an RF-4B, a recon version of the Phantom with terrain avoidance radar and a longer nose to house forward and side cameras, which interestingly had flash cartridges for night photography. The photos were also able to be developed in flight, with film cassettes able to be ejected at low altitudes, so ground commanders were able to get intelligence quicker. The aircraft were stationed at Da Nang from November 3, 1966, and remained there until 1970 with 0 losses and only 1 aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire. VMCJ-2 and VMCJ-3 provided aircraft to VMCJ-1 at Da Nang, with VMFP-3 being formed in 1975 at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, where all Marine Corps RF-4Bs were consolidated into one unit, becoming known as the Eyes of the Corps. VMFP-3 was disestablished in August of 1990 after the introduction of the Advanced Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance System was introduced for the F-18 Hornet. The F-4 remained in service with the Marines until the early 1990s, where the F-18 began to take the Phantom's place, with the last F-4s being retired at VMFA-112 at Naval Air Station Dallas, where the squadron was re-equipped with F-18s. And of course we have the United States Air Force. The United States Air Force quickly embraced the Phantom and became its largest user, and the first Phantoms to the Air Force were F-4Bs on loan from the Navy, with 27 being delivered to the 4453rd Combat Crew Training Wing at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. In November of 1963, the first operational unit was the 12th Tactical Fighter Wing, which received the first F-4Cs in January of 1964, achieving initial operational capability in October of 1964. And the first United States Air Force Phantoms to participate in Vietnam were F-4Cs from the 45th Tactical Fighter Squadron, who deployed to Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in April of 1965. Now, unlike the Navy and Marines, which flew with a pilot in the front seat and a flight officer in the back seat, the Air Force flew with rated pilots in both seats. However, they later changed the person in the back seat to a rated Air Force navigator who was also qualified as a weapons or targeting system officer, later changing the position to weapons systems officer or a WISO. And on July 10th of 1965, F-4Cs from the 45th Tactical Fighter Squadron of the 15th Tactical Fighter Wing scored the Air Force's first aerial victory after taking down a North Vietnamese MiG-17 with an AIM-9 Sidewinder. And on April 26, 1966, an F-4C from the 480th Tactical Fighter Squadron scored the first aerial victory by a U.S. aircrew over a Vietnamese MiG-21. Now, on July 24, 1965, a Phantom became the first casualty to enemy SAMs. And on October 5th of 1966, an F-4C from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing became the first U.S. aircraft to be lost to an enemy air-to-air missile. However, when talking about Phantoms in Vietnam, you can never skip Operation Bolo, when on January 2nd of 1967, Robin Olds executed the operation in response to heavy losses during Operation Rolling Thunder. Robin Olds and his flight flew out of Ubon in Thailand, simulating an F-105 strike force. In response, the North Vietnamese Air Force sent up 11 to 14 of their 16 MiG-21s that were confirmed in their inventory at the time. Instead of finding a flight of F-105s, the Vietnamese pilots found 26 F-4s, and in the ensuing battle, the North Vietnamese Air Force lost 7 MiG-21s with another 2 probable, and with 0 U.S. aircraft lost. And in the aftermath of Operation Bolo, the Vietnamese MiGs were grounded for 4 months for retraining and devising of new tactics. Now, from the initial deployment of the F-4C to Southeast Asia, United States Air Force Phantoms performed air superiority and ground attack roles, supporting not only ground troops in South Vietnam, but also performing bombing missions in Laos and North Vietnam. And due to the F-105 fleet undergoing severe attrition between 1965 and 1968, the F-4 increasingly took on the bomber role, and after November of 1970, became the primary tactical ordnance delivery system for the United States Air Force. In addition, in October of 1972, the first squadron of F-4C Wild Weasel aircraft temporarily deployed to Thailand for operations, and in total, 16 squadrons were permanently deployed to Indochina between 1965 and 1973, with 17 others deployed in temporary combat assignments. Peak numbers of Air Force F-4s in theater occurred in 1972, when there were 353 combat-capable aircraft based in Thailand. And on August 28th of 1972, Captain Steve Ritchie became the first United States Air Force ace of the war, and on September 9th of 1972, Wizzo Captain Charles B. de Bellevue became the highest scoring ace with 6 air-to-air victories. And on January 31st of 1972, the 183rd Tactical Fighter Group of the Illinois Air National Guard became the first Air National Guard unit to transition to Phantoms from the F-84F Thunderstreaks. Also, on June 2nd of 1972, a Phantom flying at supersonic speed shot down a MiG-19 over Thud Ridge, the MiG being downed with the Phantom's cannons at Mach 1.2 by Major Phil Handley. In total, the U.S. Air Force lost 445 Phantoms, with 370 being lost in combat, with 33 to MiGs, 30 to SAMs, and 307 to ground-based anti-air platforms. And on the RF-4C side of things, it was operated by 4 squadrons, losing 83 with 72 lost in combat, 7 of those being to SAMs and 65 being to ground-based anti-aircraft guns. And in total, by the end of the war, the U.S. Air Force lost 528 F-4 Phantoms, combining Navy and Marine losses of 233, 761 Phantoms in total were lost by U.S. forces in Vietnam. However, there is still more operational history to talk about, with U.S. Air Force F-4s participating in Operation Classic Resolve. Operation Classic Resolve was George Bush's response to the 1989 Philippine coup attempt, with the Phantoms buzzing rebel aircraft parked at their airfields and being ordered to shoot them down if they took off. And surprisingly, on August 15th of 1990, 24 F-4Gs and 6 RF-4Cs were deployed to Issa Air Base in Bahrain for Operation Desert Storm. The F-4G was the only aircraft in the Air Force's inventory at the time equipped for suppression of enemy air defenses, and was used to protect coalition aircraft from Iraq's air defense systems. In addition, the RF-4Cs were the only aircraft equipped with the KS-127 LOROP, or long-range oblique photography cameras, where they were used for a variety of reconnaissance missions. One RF-4C was lost in a fatal accident, and one F-4G was lost when the aircraft's fuel tanks were punctured by enemy ground fire and the aircraft ran out of fuel near a friendly airbase. The last F-4Gs were retired in March 26 of 1996, with the last operational Air National Guard F-4 being flown in April of 1996. Now, just like the Navy, the Air Force also operated QF-4 target drones, with the aircraft operating out of Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida and Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, with the aircraft being consolidated at Holloman Air Force Base in 2015. The Air Force operated QF-4s until August 17, 2016, with the last QF-4E being fired upon by an F-35 Lightning II, and the remaining 13 were stripped of their systems and transferred to White Sands Missile Range to be used as static targets, bringing an end to the F-4's operational service with the U.S. military. Now, there were numerous operators of the Phantom, and we will go over the other operators after we go over the Phantoms that served with the German Air Force, as they were the largest export customer. So we start at the beginning, where the German Luftwaffe found itself in need of numerous new aircraft following a publication from NATO and its new flexible response doctrine. With the shift towards fighting another conventional war in Europe, the Luftwaffe of Western Germany found their RF-104Gs and F-104Gs obsolete. With the aircraft being unable to operate in bad weather at night and deeming its performance against the MiG-21 insufficient for air defense and air superiority missions, the situation was dire, and with age and fatigue rates putting the Luftwaffe's strength below its required numbers by 1976, and with the ongoing development of the Panavia Tornado and not enough capital to develop their own aircraft, they turned to foreign aircraft. There were 2 different requirements, a reconnaissance aircraft and a fighter aircraft. So to start, we'll look over the reconnaissance platform. The selection pool for the reconnaissance role was relatively small, with the Canadair CF-5AR, the Mirage 3R, the Saab S-35E, the RTF-104G, and the F-4E. The F-4E was a based equivalent of the United States Air Force's own RF-4C intended for export. Now, the RTF-104G was just a heavily modified TF-104G and was substantially cheaper than the RF-4Es, as it was able to use the existing infrastructure and able to be produced under license in-country from the already existing F-104G production line. However, the advantages of the Phantom and the West German Luftwaffe's experience with the F-104 made the Phantom more favorable. So, in 1969, the German Defense Ministry decided to procure 88 RF-4Es, with the contract price coming out to 2 billion Deutschmarks. And while in American aircraft, they weren't fully constructed in America, with MBB producing stabilizers, landing gear doors, outer wings, and ailerons, which were then shipped to McDonnell Douglas's St. Louis factory for final assembly. The RF-4E first flew for the West German Air Force on September 5, 1970, with the first delivery of 4 aircraft on January 20, 1971. Pilots were sent to Shaw Air Force Base between January of 1970 to May of 1971 to provide training for future RF-4E pilots. In addition, 108 pilots were trained at George Air Force Base between October 10, 1970 and February 4, 1972 for 5-week flight courses, and after returning to Germany, they also received additional sensor training from the previously mentioned flight instructors. And in 1978, due to the Warsaw Pact's rising lethality with advancements in aircraft and air defenses, it was decided to retrofit RF-4Es for a secondary ground attack role. They received the same equipment as the fighter variant, the F-4F, currently in service with the German Air Force, receiving improved chaff and flare systems, a more capable radar warning receiver, and new infrared cameras to improve their reconnaissance capabilities. Later, in the mid-1980s, they received another upgrade as there were no plans for a replacement before 2005. For this upgrade, 71 aircraft received airframe upgrades to increase max flight hours from 4,500 to 8,000 hours, laser and GPS navigation systems, a new AN APQ-172 terrain-following radar, and integration with the AIM-9L. However, after German reunification and the Cold War coming to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sharp drawdown in military spending, so they began selling the aircraft to other nations. 27 RF-4Es were sold to the Greek Air Force, and another 46 were sold to the Turkish Air Force, with the aircraft being retired in 1994 and the last example being handed over to the Museum of the Luftwaffe on November 23, 2003. Now, in terms of the fighter role, it was the same process as the reconnaissance type. However, there were 2 key requirements, with those being the aircraft must have an all-weather navigation system and 2 engines. Now, there were quite a few more aircraft in this competition, with the Seppicat Jaguar, the Saab Viggen, Dassault Mirage F1, Northrop F5, Northrop P530, and of course the F-4F. However, at this point the RF-4E was already adopted, and combining the advantages it brought, the F-4F was declared the winner, and 175 aircraft were ordered on June 24, 1971, under the Peace Rhine program. The F-4F was a simplified version of the Air Force's F-4E, missing the ram air turbine, rear fuselage fuel tank, slatted stabilizers, and the ability to use the AIM-7 Sparrow. Missing these components, the aircraft was 3,300 pounds lighter and was notably more maneuverable, especially at low speeds. All but the first F-4F were produced the same way as the RF-4Es, and all aircraft were delivered between 1973 and 1976, making Germany the largest export customer of the Phantom. The F-4F first flew on March 18th of 1973 and was publicly revealed on May 24th that same year, with 12 aircraft being delivered to George Air Force Base to stand up an operational conversion unit, with pilots from Fighter Wing 71 arriving January 1st, 1974. Now, due to the urgent need for the aircraft in frontline service, the F-4Fs were replaced with 10 new F-4Es in 1975, so the F-4Fs could be sent to Germany for immediate use. The F-4Es remained in the US for training until their retirement in 1997, and a single F-4F was also kept in the US to provide a testbed for new technologies for the aircraft. The F-4Fs also received upgrade in the mid-1980s, receiving a new digital weapons computer, changes to the radar to allow for bombing through cloud cover, a new heads-up display, integration for the AIM-9L and AGM-65B Maverick, and new chaff and flare dispensers. The centerline drop tank was also replaced with a lower drag model used by the F-15C, as well as a new radar warning receiver and jamming pods. And with the same situation in the RF-4E and increasing Warsaw Pact capabilities, there was a need for a more capable fighter aircraft. There was a consideration for procurement of Tornado ADVs, however it was decided to upgrade the F-4F fleet, and with that decision we get the ICE program, or Improved Combat Efficiency Program, beginning in 1983. Its goal was to fit the aircraft with improved air-to-air and air-to-ground weaponry, including beyond visual range missiles and standoff engagement weapons. To start, 153 active aircraft received modest upgrades in the Ground Attack or Luftangriff program to improve their ground strike capabilities, receiving a laser navigation system and structural upgrades to extend the maximum flight hours from 4,000 to 6,500. 110 of these aircraft were further upgraded to the Air Defense or Luftverteidigung program, receiving an AN/APG 65GY radar, which was a pulse Doppler I-band radar system. It also received a new mission computer and compatibility with the AIM-120 AMRAAM. The ICE Phantoms entered service in 1992 and were deployed under the Baltic Air Policing mission starting in 2005 and operating under that mission in 2008, 2009, 2011, and 2012. The last F-4F was retired on June 29, 2013, with the aircraft type flying 279,000 hours from its service entry to its retirement. Now that we've covered the largest export user, let's cover the rest, and for the sake of this video's length, I'll touch on them lightly. Starting with Australia, where they leased 24 U.S. Air Force F-4Es from 1970 to 1973 while waiting for their F-111Cs to be delivered. They were so well liked, there was a consideration to retain them after the F-111C's delivery. However, that never came to be. Egypt purchased 35 former Air Force F-4Es along with a number of Sparrows, Sidewinders, and Mavericks for $594 million in the Peace Pharaoh program. An additional 7 aircraft were purchased in 1988, and 3 additional attrition replacements were received by the end of the 1990s. Egyptian F-4s were retired in 2020, with F-16C models and D models taking their place. Greece purchased 36 new F-4Es in 1972, and in 1990, the Hellenic Air Force acquired 27 surplus RF-4Es and 50 F-4Es, which included 19 F-4G Wild Weasels, operating 113 total Phantoms. Due to the success of the German ICE program, the German company DASA and the Hellenic aerospace industry upgraded 39 aircraft to a similar standard named Peace Icarus 2000. Greece retired the RF-4Es on May 5, 2017, with the upgraded F-4Es still being in service to this day, though they are in the process of being retired. Another big export customer was Iran, which prior to the Iranian Revolution received 225 F-4D, F-4E, and RF-4E Phantoms, making it the second largest export customer. And post-revolution Islamic Republic or Iran Air Force Phantoms saw heavy action in the Iran-Iraq War and were kept operational by overhauls and servicing by Iran's aerospace industry. On a fun note, 2 Iranian Phantoms were part of the famous You Should Go Home incident, where an F-22 flew under the aircraft and after assessing their weaponry told the 2 Phantoms, "You should go home now," without being detected until issuing the warning. To this day, Iran still operates the F-4 Phantom. However, an exact number is difficult to obtain, and the closest I was able to find was in the ballpark of 60 aircraft. Sticking in the same region, Israel also operated the Phantom, with the country acquiring between 212 and 222 newly built and ex-United States Air Force aircraft. Initial aircraft were delivered in 1969 under the Peace Echo 1 program, with additional Phantoms arriving in the 70s under Peace Echo 2, Peace Echo 5, and Nickel Grass programs. Israeli Phantoms saw extensive combat use and underwent a few upgrade programs, with the aircraft being retired officially in 2004. Japan also operated the aircraft, with Mitsubishi building 138 aircraft under license and importing 14 unarmed reconnaissance RF-4Es. These aircraft served from 1968 to March of 2021. Again in the same region, South Korea operated 92 F-4Ds, 27 RF-4Cs, and 103 F-4Es. And interestingly, in 1975, South Korea fundraised to buy 5 new Phantoms, with the money to purchase the aircraft coming from citizens in a national fundraising drive, with South Korea's Phantoms being retired in June of 2024. Jumping back to Europe, Spain operated 58 Phantoms, with 40 F-4Cs operating from 1971 to 1989 and 18 RF-4Cs operating from 1978 to 2002. Turkey operated 192 Phantoms with 152 F-4Es with various upgrade programs and 40 RF-4Es, again with various upgrade programs. 19 Phantoms are still in service with the Turkish Air Force, with expectations to remain in service until 2030. And finally, the last export customer was the United Kingdom. Now there is an extensive history with the UK and its Phantoms, much more than I can put into this video. If you guys are interested, I would be happy to do a separate in-depth video about the British Phantoms. But some basic facts: the UK bought naval F-4Js and was in fact the only country outside of the US that operated the Phantoms at sea. In total, they operated 185 Phantoms, with 170 of those being specially built for use in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, with designations being FG-1 for the Navy and FGR-2 for the Air Force. The other 15 were acquired F-4Js, which were purchased in 1984 and were refurbished and designated F-4J UK, with their Phantoms being retired in January of 1994. And as a final note, NASA did operate F-4s in various capacities, and there is actually a civilian F-4D operated by the Collings Foundation that performs and flies to various air shows as a living display of history. I'm not sure I can say much more about the Phantom. It is a legendary aircraft, and when people think about Vietnam, they picture a Phantom dropping ordnance and close air support missions. At least I do anyways. This aircraft is what started my love for aviation. It lit that fire inside me that still burns to this day. It was ugly and utilitarian, built to deliver air power with whatever country it operated with, wherever it was in the world. This aircraft is definitely in my top 5 aircraft, and I'm more than happy I get to fly it in almost any aviation game I've played and be able to make this video. Take it as a love letter for the aircraft that started my love for military aviation. Speaking of flying it, what games can you fly it in? Well, point to one, it's probably in there. To list a few though, it's in Project Wingman, War Thunder, DCS, Ace Combat, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and a little indie game called Tiny Combat Arena, just to name a few. There are also community mods for it in Arma 3 and Arma Reforger, and a slew of other games where you have the freedom to build things. With one of my favorite games, From the Depths, having quite a few. It's such a popular aircraft, you won't have any issues finding a game where you can fly it. As always, thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe learned a thing or two. As always, if you have any suggestions or constructive criticism, please leave a comment and let me know. Also, let me know if I got something wrong. The best knowledge really is a collective one, and I'm always happy to learn more. If you would like to see more of these videos in the future, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with when and what I post, as well as community updates, as I am using that to update people on the status of the videos as they progress through production phases. If you guys would like to see something covered, please leave a suggestion for what I check out next. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time. I hope you all have a good day, night, evening, wherever you are in the world, and I hope you have clear skies and easy flying.